This speech was supposed to be on a topic that was of our choice, a topic that we had done this past year in a public speaking course. So for this speech, I have decided to talk about explaining some complex material, or basically just a subject that I really enjoy. So what subject is that? It is the subject of the Saturn V rocket. Let's start with what is the Saturn V rocket. Saturn V rocket was the rocket used to launch man and land them on the moon, way back in 1969. The Saturn V rocket was the largest rocket of its time and continues to still hold the record of being one of the largest rockets ever built. The Saturn V, or Saturn capital V, was called the Saturn V because it was what's called a stage rocket. We'll get into that in a couple of minutes. A stage rocket basically has different stages. This particular one had 5 stages. So, what are some of its specs or statistics? It had 5 different stages, hence the Saturn Roman numeral for 5V. It was a total of 363 feet tall, which included all of the different stages stacked together and mounted together. It was a stage rocket, as I've said before, which basically means it could come apart into different parts. In this case, it could come apart into 5 main sections. Once one section was used up, most of the sections were rocket fuel and engines. Once one section was burnt out, it was dropped off and the next stage would kick in. So let's start talking about the different stages. As you can see on the board, I have a whole rocket drawn out. We'll start with the first stage. The first stage, way down here, is the main stage that really got the rocket launched off the launch pad and going towards low Earth orbit. It consisted of 5 Rocketdyne F1 rocket engines capable of 7.891 million pounds of force on liftoff. That's a lot of force. It was about 12 feet, well, one of these Rocketdyne F1 engines were about 12 feet tall and about 18 and a half feet tall and about 12 feet wide. That's probably about the size of your living room. The first stage would fire for about 2.5 minutes before all the rocket fuel stored inside of it was used up and would get dropped away from the rest of the rocket on top of it. Once the first stage was used up, it moved on and ignited the second stage. The second stage was dramatically smaller and had much smaller engines. It had 5 J2 rocket engines capable of about 1 million pounds of force. That's still a lot of force, in my opinion, at any rate. The second stage kept the rocket moving towards low Earth orbit. It didn't quite get it there, but it helped to get it most of the rest of the way. Once the second stage was used up, it was entirely rocket engines and rocket fuel. Once that rocket fuel was burnt out, it was useless and was dropped away like the first stage. They then lit the third stage up here, which consisted of 1 J2 rocket engine. And they lit it for 165 seconds to get it into low Earth orbit. Once in low Earth orbit, they shut it off, waiting for and left it on because they still needed to get it to put it into a path with the moon, to get them to the moon. Then we have the 5th and 4th stages. The 5th stage is the lunar module. It was attached to the top of the 3rd stage, and the 5th stage was attached to the top of that. What it was the lunar module with an outer exoskeleton housing to protect it during liftoff. After it had gotten onto course with the moon, they dropped this exoskeleton and docked the 5th stage to the 4th. The fifth stage was the command and service module. The command module is where the astronauts spent most of their time, and the service module is what kept the astronauts alive and moving towards the moon. Now let's look at the path that the mission took. We'll start way back down on Earth on Cape Canaveral, JFK Space Center. Right down here. On liftoff, we have ignition of the first stage, pushing it towards Earth orbit. Once the first stage is used up, they drop that, start the second stage, keep it moving towards Earth orbit. Once the second stage is used up, they move on to the third stage and put it into Earth orbit. Technically speaking, it would be low Earth orbit. They then shut the third stage off, waited for the right moment, which was right about here, to reignite it, and put it out of Earth orbit towards the moon. Once the third, fourth, and fifth stages had been put into what was called translunar injection, which is basically just on course towards the moon. Once the third, fourth, and fifth stages were in that, the lunar module stayed attached to the third stage while the exoskeleton was taken away, or just dropped off, and the command and service module was detached, turned 180, docked to the top of the lunar module. So basically, the top of the command and service module here turned around and docked to the top of the lunar module there. They then dropped to the third stage as they didn't need it anymore, did a full 180, so it was the command module was now pointing towards the moon once again and traveled to the moon. Once at the moon, they had to fire the command and service module at about this point way down here, so that it would put it into lunar orbit. Once in lunar orbit, the two astronauts that landed on the moon jumped in the lunar module, came down, landed on the moon. Once they had landed on the moon, they did whatever they did down there, explore a bit, get lots of samples, launch back up into lunar orbit, dock with the command and service module, which stayed in lunar orbit while the lunar module landed on the moon. They then transferred the astronauts and space goods to the command module, did one more orbit or whatever, and did what's called trans-Earth injection, which basically put the spaceship back into path with Earth along here. They eventually got to Earth orbit. Once they had gotten to Earth orbit, they dropped the service module and set the command module so it would fall back and re-enter into Earth's atmosphere and land into one of the oceans. So in the end of this whole massive rocket that was used to get us to the moon, the only bit that returned were the astronauts and this small command module. That's about it for this speech. Thank you for listening.